President Donald Trump certainly ended this week in a fantastic mood as he could be seen working the press room crowd. Take a look at this.
Yeah, please. By the way, so many questions. Should we keep this going, Pam? This is the opposite of Biden. Biden would take a half a question and he'd leave without answering it. Go ahead.
On Iran.
You tell me when it gets boring, okay?
But what has him in such a good mood? Well, it's very simple. This week was perhaps the best week he has had during his entire presidency so far. And right here on American Advocates, I'm going to briefly recap all of the incredible things that happened for the MAGA movement this week. It all started a week ago with the Iran nuclear program crisis and the Iran-Israel war. President Donald Trump stealthily and tactically moved B-2 bombers into position to take out Iran's nuclear facility, dropping several 30,000-pound mop bombs on 3 different nuclear bases with extreme precision, utterly destroying their capabilities to make a weaponized nuclear bomb. And despite liberal fake news media rhetoric, the damage seems to be utter and complete obliteration of their bases. You can see in this before footage what the base looked like, and then in the after footage, the devastation of the bomb. And mind you, that's really only 10% of it, because these photos are satellite images showing only above the ground. These mop bombs burrow deep before exploding. But it got even crazier after Trump bombed Iran and took out their nuclear facilities. America was panicking. A lot of Americans, especially millennials and Gen Zers, struggle from what we call Middle East fatigue. We don't want another war in the Middle East, especially after the last one was drawn out for over 20 years and ended rather fruitlessly. So the concern was rightfully there that boots on the ground would eventually need to be deployed and we'd be dragged into another war. However, President Donald Trump was far too smart for this. And somehow, some way, not only did he bomb Iran, but President Donald Trump managed to do what he's honestly always done. The president of peace, President Trump, managed to broker a peace deal in the form of a ceasefire between Israel and Iran. Congratulations to everyone. It has been officially agreed by and between Israel and Iran that there will be a complete and total ceasefire. Yeah, that actually happened. And of course, both sides were a little bit reluctant and they broke the ceasefire up front. But President Donald Trump, being the man that he is, came out with perhaps the most firm way to respond to this, as covered by CNN, in what is now being deemed a very iconic quote from an American president.
At the time, there was a question as to whether Israel and Iran would honor a ceasefire. That caused the president to offer the most unfiltered, non-controversial, direct words that I can recall anybody ever saying about the Middle East.
We basically have 2 countries that have been fighting so long and so hard that they don't know what the they're doing. Do you understand that?
And so far since this moment, as far as we can tell, this ceasefire has now upheld and peace has been established in that region. Immediately after this, President Donald Trump left for the NATO summit. Now, this is something that President Donald Trump has campaigned on. It's a promise of his, where he assured the American people that despite the fact that our NATO allies were absolutely taking advantage of America's much bigger wallet than most of these other countries, that he would no longer tolerate them under-investing in the overall NATO defense budget. Most of these countries were skating by, just contributing 2% towards the defense budget, while America covered the rest. President Donald Trump went in there, and moments after being called Daddy Trump from the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte.
They've had a big fight, like 2 kids in a schoolyard. You know, they fight like hell. You can't stop them. Let them fight for about 2-3 minutes. Then it's easy to stop them.
And then Daddy has to sometimes use strong language.
You have to use strong language. Every once in a while you have to use a certain word.
President Donald Trump managed to negotiate with all the rest of the countries in NATO, except for Spain, which refused, and all of them agreed that they will step up their defense spending to the 5% that it needs to be. In the words of President Donald Trump, America is respected again.
NATO over the weekend. They have great respect for our country now. They did things that nobody thought was possible. They took funding from 2% to 5%. Nobody thought they'd ever pay the 2%, and now they're paying the 5%. It's over $1 trillion more a year. Think of that, $1 trillion. Nobody thought that could happen. That's a different group of people, different countries. But we get along with a lot of countries. We are respected again. Our country, the U.S., is respected again. Was not respected 6 months ago, I can tell you.
But the news kept getting better. And honestly, in my opinion, the news peaked with this landmark Supreme Court ruling in the case of Trump versus Casa Inc., where President Donald Trump was being challenged on his deportation and immigration policies, especially when it came to the 14th Amendment and birthright citizenship. Now, mind you, the liberals purposefully misinterpret birthright citizenship and the 14th Amendment. They want you to think that any child born here in America, regardless of their parents' immigration status, is immediately a naturalized citizen. And that was not the original intent of the 14th Amendment. President Donald Trump knows this. He doesn't stand for it. And any child considered an anchor baby who's born to an illegal immigrant who literally could have moments ago hopped over the wall into Texas or Arizona or New Mexico and plopped out a child will no longer have that child recognized as a naturalized citizen. Both the parent or parents and child will be deported back, and rightfully so. And the way the liberals were fighting this was using low-level district court judges to file injunctions on the president to halt his national and foreign policies. This is absurd levels of lawfare, and the Supreme Court recognized that, ruling in a 6-3 ruling that the low-level district court judges' injunctions can no longer apply to President Donald Trump at a national level. Only in their district can that injunction apply, which is how it always should have been. These judges were massively overstepping their power and were being used as tools by the liberals to halt the president. It was their last resort, in fact. It was the last thing they had to hold on to because the Democrats currently do not have control of the House or the Senate or the Supreme Court. So they are now powerless. In fact, they realize how powerless they are. Look at the meltdown from this absolute disgusting MSNBC reporter, Nicole Wallace, when she was covering the ruling of the Supreme Court right here.
Hi there, everyone. Happy Friday. It's 4 o'clock in the East. Quote, an existential threat to the rule of law. Rarely has the liberal wing of the United States Supreme Court sounded as alarmed about the direction of the country and the court as it does right now. The justices referring to the decision handed down today by the Supreme Court in the birthright citizenship case. In a 6-3 ruling, the Supreme Court curbed the ability of lower court judges to issue nationwide injunctions. Now, those are basically rulings that stop things, illegal things, rulings that block policies from going into place nationwide. Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett, writing for the conservative majority, said that nationwide injunctions are an overreach of judicial power. And she writes this, quote, when a court concludes that the executive branch has acted unlawfully, the answer is not for the court to exceed its power too. Now, the judges didn't rule on the substance of all this. They didn't render a decision on the merits of Donald Trump's decision to end birthright citizenship for the children of undocumented immigrants. Instead, what the court did today was to rule on the process piece of this. They ruled that judges can only issue decisions or rulings that deliver relief for the group of people involved, for the people who sued, the plaintiffs, and that they could not block that policy from going into effect nationwide for anyone else who might be affected by the policy.
Now, when, of course, it comes to her coverage of the Supreme Court ruling, President Donald Trump has a message for her.
Oh, shut up, silly woman.
And this is the correct way that the covering of this Supreme Court ruling should be reported, being talked about by President Donald Trump himself. Take a listen.
Don't see that, but this case is very important. I was elected on a historic mandate, but in recent months we've seen a handful of radical left judges effectively try to overrule the rightful powers of the president to stop the American people from getting the policies that they voted for in record numbers. It was a grave threat to democracy, frankly, and instead of merely ruling on the immediate cases before them, these judges have attempted to dictate the law for the entire nation. In practice, this meant that if any one of the nearly 700 federal judges disagreed with the policy of a duly elected president of the United States, he or she could block that policy from going into effect or at least delay it for many years, tie it up in the court system. This was a colossal abuse of power which never occurred in American history prior to recent decades. and we've been hit with more nationwide injunctions than were issued in the entire 20th century together. Think of it, more than the entire 20th century, me. I'm grateful to the Supreme Court for stepping in and solving this very, very big and complex problem, and they've made it very simple.
And now for the icing on the cake. You see, the best week peaked right there, but the icing on the cake does make it so much better. News that General Electric, for instance, is now leaving China to move their manufacturing to Kentucky, creating hundreds of jobs for Americans, and once again a shining example of how the Trump tariffs work to make America better and serve American people even better. And on the subject of those tariffs, we were promised after the announcement of Liberation Day that a Great Depression was coming our way. Our economy was going to tank, inflation was going to soar, and consumer confidence was going to dive down to the lowest of lows, and that all around this would be the end of our nation. I personally, of course, did not heed this warning. I invested in NVIDIA on the April 8th dip, and I am one happy camper. But overall, the stock market is now reflecting quite the opposite of what these professional economists promised would happen. The S&P 500 rose to record highs. It is now higher than it was on the Liberation Day tariffs announcement, and it is now the highest it's been for the entirety of Trump's presidential term so far. In fact, it is the highest it's ever been. The stock market is booming and soaring to new heights. And to make matters even sweeter, summer gas prices are now the lowest that they've been since 2021. Funny how that was just a few months after former President Joe Biden got in. Those gas prices were quickly out of control under his rule, but now, within 5.5 months of President Donald Trump being in office, they're now the lowest they've been. Interesting, right? And so good is our economy doing under President Donald Trump that even the liberals' precious Real News, CNN, is absolutely glazing President Donald Trump, forced to report on the reality of the situation when it comes to the economy right here in America. Take a listen to this.
Back at home, Trump claimed that he's reached a trade deal with China and soon expects the same with India. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick told Bloomberg that the deal was signed earlier this week. China's Commerce Ministry said Friday the two sides had further confirmed the details of the framework. Of course, Trump's initial imposition of tariffs wreaked havoc on American markets back in the spring. But now the markets have rebounded and grown. The S&P 500, NASDAQ hit record highs just yesterday. And it's not just the stock market. Inflation, the great economic fear of recent times, seems to be tamed. The rate is now reported at 2.4%, down from a high of 7% just 4 years ago. Meanwhile, blue-collar workers have seen real wage growth of 1.7% in Trump's first 5 months. This is the largest such increase in nearly 3 generations. Notwithstanding its impact on our national debt, there's also hope among some that Trump's big, beautiful bill will give further financial relief to blue-collar workers, as well as create incentives to build more factories in the U.S.
That is one rare sight indeed. CNN being forced to just admit how amazing things are under President Donald Trump. I personally didn't think I'd ever see the day. And finally, to top all of this off, the border. The illegal border crossings are now officially at 0. When Democrats were in power, Congress was insistent that this was impossible, and that if we wanted to reduce border crossings, we would need a bill passed. A bill, in fact, where Democrats were going to sneak in a bunch of nonsense policies, mind you, holding essentially America at ransom over their outrageous and egregious open border policies. President Donald Trump, in under 6 months, has managed to reduce illegal border crossings to 0, and he wants everyone to pay attention to that fact. Take a listen here and listen for the humorous reporter in the press room who is elated at this news and shouts out, "Trump 2028.
Thank you so much, President Trump. Illegal crossings in the border are 0 now.
0. Does everyone hear that? 0.
Trump 2028.
Do you intend, President Trump?
Who's that guy? I like him. He's working the cameras.
You gotta love it. This has been by far, like I said, perhaps the best week since President Donald Trump has taken office. It certainly is a runner-up for the first week he took office, where he just immediately signed in dozens of executive orders fulfilling campaign promises like that. MAGA right now is riding high, and so is President Donald Trump, as he can now finally act as the president of the United States again, and liberals are now powerless to stand in his way. Charlie Kirk on X summarized this week the best, stating this: "No nukes for Iran. Ceasefire in the Middle East. Stock market hits a record high. Border is totally secure. Deportations accelerating at record levels. Peace between Rwanda and Congo. And massive tax cut to pass. Have a great weekend, everyone." Forgot to even mention that there's peace now between the Congo and Rwanda. A 30-year war is coming to an end because of President Donald Trump. And they're so happy over there that the Congo politicians are nominating President Donald Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize. What are your thoughts and opinions on that? Does President Donald Trump deserve the Nobel Peace Prize? Comment down below with what you think. Subscribe to this channel for more America First content and like the video.